Alright, so in the video today we're going to go over the working components and those things that are serviceable in the alternator for a 1979 Super Beetle. This car, the reason why we took this apart was that it was showing signs of metal shavings kind of showing up inside the engine compartment. And so when we started investigating, we found that in fact the rear bearing had gone out and it was rubbing on the inside of the alternator. The alternator was still working, and I'm sure that I could have just replaced the bearing and continued using this. It probably would have worked fine, but I really didn't like all of the buildup of the metal shavings inside this these electrical components in here, and you can see the wear right in here where it was actually touching. And so I decided, nope, not going to do that. So I went ahead and got a remanufactured or rebuilt alternator right here. But what I wanted to do when I was shopping for the alternator, they have a lot of different prices and capabilities. Some of the prices were based on the amperage output. This is a 60 amp alternator that I'm putting in here. But the other thing that was a price consideration was whether or not it was a chrome-plated alternator or not. And I really like the look of the chrome-plated alternator, but when you look at the actual installation on the alternator, it looks pretty when you're holding the whole thing, but then there's a lot of accoutrements that go on after the fact. I mean, the pulley goes on and covers, a good portion of the front of the alternator, and then there's a strap that comes across here. This is black, and you're not going to get away from that. This is a fuel-injected car, so that the air box comes across here, so you won't even see the back half of this. So it didn't make sense to me to spend some $200 or however much it was. They're a bit more expensive than standard to get a chrome-plated alternator when so much of the chrome was going to be hidden. With that in mind, that doesn't mean that I don't want to have a shiny alternator. When you look at the way that these are formed, this is just aluminum, and they put them in a sand mold, and then they machine out the parts that where it needs to fit, right? So it has kind of a rough sand finish to it. And I thought to myself, you know what? I've done other projects where I've taken this rough sand finish on like a carburetor housing or some other raw piece of aluminum, and you sand down all that rough finish, and then you can polish that. And so that's what we're going to do today. Is I'm gonna go through the parts that are serviceable, should you choose to service yours instead of replacing it, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to polish. My plan here is to polish the visible side of this. The pulley comes to here, so you'll have about an inch viewable right here, and then this whole section right here is visible. So I'm going to go ahead and polish that as well. So we're going to polish the new alternator so that we get the value that we want without having to get a chrome alternator, and hopefully that'll give us the best of both worlds. So let's go ahead and get started on what kind of components that make up the alternator and which of those are actually serviceable. Okay, so let's start with what failed on our alternator to cause this whole iteration. This is the back plate. The back plate of the alternator goes on the back of the housing, back here, just like that. There are some bushings and whatnot, but this was the failure point. That bearing is not supposed to be moving around in there. But you can see with these little screw holes here, that bearing is replaceable. So if you detect it before it does any damage, if you get some wobbling, you can hear it actually when you're accelerating or decelerating, kind of a woo, kind of weird, kind of a whirring noise. in the cooling fan, or the fan shroud will make kind of a shuffling noise. That's a sign that this is rattling around in there, and that if you catch it soon enough, you can keep it from tearing itself apart. But you can take just a couple of screws here, you press this bearing out, and they sell these. You can get a new bearing to replace that. So that's one piece that is serviceable, and you can edit that component if you need to get it replaced. This right here is the voltage regulator. You see it has a Bosch part number in there. 190087003. This is a looks like it's a product of Brazil. Anyway, this is a voltage regulator. It's part of the alternator, and it's actually, when you're looking at it, it's installed right in the back of the housing, right here. These little screws right here. That's where it's mounted. You can see they go in right there, and you'll see that up in there like this, right? If your voltage regulator has gone out, just go through the same exercise that we did in our previous video about how to take the alternator out. You can just take the back plate off to gain access to that. You don't have to take any of the rest of this off. It's just 2 screws, real easy to get to. One of the other components in here that is probably serviceable is this front bearing. This bearing right here is the front bearing on the armature. It has some interesting little pulleys that go into there. But if you get a wobble in this front bearing, it can be pressed on, and you can replace that bearing as well. It really isn't that difficult to get that out of the aluminum plate here. Just a little tap with a hammer and a deep well socket. I just put the deep well socket on here. You knock it down, it comes right out. I didn't even have to hit it that hard. It just taps right out. But you can see that bearing surface meets up with this outside bearing surface here, and that's serviceable as well. This is the coil wrapping. These are what actually catch the current. And if, in my view, if you have any kind of touching or damage, any kind of wear on the inside of this, I would call that scratch. You can't do anything with it. It's not like you can buy another one of these, but when you're inspecting it to see if you want to buy a new one, this is where you need to look. Right here to look to see if you've had any touching. If it touches, then you've got some wear. There's a lot of tolerance in here. You can see the distance between these gaps in here, but you can see this is what was rubbing. This is much heavier. This is these magnets really have a lot of force to them. But you can see all the copper, everything. Nothing was damaged. So, you know, I mean, ultimately, this can be put back into service once you clean it up. But I'm not going to do that. I don't want to take the risk. There was a lot of metal shavings floating around in there, and I don't want to take a risk of carbon tracking. Carbon tracks are when electrical circuit will be formed by the magnetic attractable forces that will give the electricity a short track to go to a short, and then you'll have all kinds of problems with that. Now, all of these copper windings have a kind of a shellac on them, a varnish, so you know they don't have any actual exposed copper, although you can see it. But with that said, during installation, and you know, anything can cause just a little bit of a scratch on that, and it can become exposed. I don't want to risk it. I'd much rather have a dependable charging system, and so I am not going to risk putting that back into service. So that's it. Those are the serviceable components that you can manage in here. If you catch this before it gets too bad, you see a wobble, you can replace both the front and the rear bearings, and the voltage regulator, which is inside, can also be replaced. All right, so let's get busy on cleaning up this new one and getting it ready to put into service in the car. All right, so first thing we're going to do is I want to protect the internal components from any kind of dust. We're going to be sanding this material here, so aluminum is going to be coming off of this material, this surface here, and we don't want that aluminum to get down in there, right? So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to fill these up so that they don't have like a void, and then I'm going to use some tape, and I'm going to tape the area that I intend not to sand. And that should protect it from, any kind of sanding material, whether it be the abrasive material or any aluminum that comes off from the sanding when I'm prepping this from getting down in there. We'll do that in the back side here as well. I don't think I need to put any filler in that. And then I'll cover this entire back section back here with tape as well. We don't want to let anything in there. We're only going to polish this portion and this portion. So it's not going to be a whole lot that we're going to have to do, but I don't want any dust to get down in there to cause a problem later on. All right, so let's tape this thing up. All right, so the exercise here is to remove the rough surface and replace it with a slightly less rough surface. So this is an 80 grit disc. You can use just a regular sheet of 80 grit paper. I like the disc because it holds together better. It's made to be run at a high speed, so the material stays on better. And the trick with the lower grits is you don't want to make any cupping or change the geometry or the shape. So you want to go heavy enough with this so that it is no longer has a sand look, but you want to have 80 grit grooves. And then when after you're done with the 80 grit, you'll go to a 220 grit and you'll remove the 80 grit grooves and put 220 grooves in it. And when you get to the 220, you do the 320, and obviously you're making smaller and smaller grooves. And what you want to do when you're doing this as you're progressing through the grits is you don't want to leave any of the scratch marks from the previous grit on there. You want to have nothing but a homogeneous look from the grit that you're currently on. And you progress from 80 to 220 to 320 to 800, 1000, and 2000. After you get to the 2000, we're going to introduce a buffing wheel. Then we'll get into actually using power tools, and we'll run the buffing wheel on there with iron oxide. This is oddly enough rust. This material right here is really fine jeweler's wheel, and we'll polish this up. You see it turns black because of the aluminum on it, but anyway, that's the finished product, and then you'll see what it looks like. It'll be almost like glass. But the real trick is to try to keep from getting any kind of cupping or waving so that you can get a nice flat finish. If I were to use a wheel or a Dremel tool, you'd have to be very, very cautious not to let it sit because it'll make a divot. And so we're going to just manually run along this surface with this. I'm gonna bend it into different shapes so that I can get into the chamfers. And we're going to take off this sanded look, and then we'll progress through the different grades. Looks like I may need to add something right in here to keep. I don't know if that. I'll check it on the other one to see if that is something I need to protect against. See if there's any kind of pass through right there. But all right, so let's get started. All right, this little section right here, you can see there's a lot of flag or slag from the die when they broke it from the mold. Normally they grind that off, but you know there's a whole bunch right here. It's gonna take a little more work to get that nice and flat. But I want that one flat like this one, nice and flat. Otherwise it won't polish because it's got all those bumps in it. All right, so that file took it down a bit, but that's about as far as we're going to go. We're just going to have a divot there. I don't want to get involved in that screw. All right, that all looks really good. Moving on to this surface. So you can already see a bit of a sheen on that compared to the dull. So that, you know, it's an improvement. It gets better and better as you go. Now, I am not going to do the bottom. I'm just going to stop at this rib right here because nobody will ever see that. That's the bottom. You'd have to be underneath the car. You wouldn't even see it if you're underneath the car because there's a flashing right here. But these surfaces right here will be very visible. So I'm going to polish all the way to that rib, which is, it's like right here on this, and it'll be midway on this one. So we'll get as much as we can that's going to be visible, and then we'll move on to the next grade. All right, so that's 80 grit. All the way around, all the surfaces that I'm going to polish at 80 grit. Now you notice I used a couple of other tools. One was the chisel. Obviously this metal is stronger than the aluminum, so as long as you do it in a controlled fashion, you won't really damage the tool that much. You're not going to chip at it. But you know, if you're into woodwork, you'll know that it doesn't matter how sharp your chisel is, you will have to resharpen it. So it's not a big deal that I use a chisel on that. The real trick is just not to make any gouges that are any deeper. So for the detail work around here, I use that chisel. I also used a metal file. So there was some places where the molding had kind of made some seams, and so we filed those seams down to make them flush. It's kind of a shortcut, just like anything. You know, it's just one step higher than the 80 grit. So once you file it down, then you use the 80 grit to make the 80 grit grooves in there. And so okay, now we're going to move on down to the 120, or the 220, and then we'll get to the 320. So you'll see that it already has a nice sheen to it. It's a lot better than the you know, the sand finish. Here's the sand finish. Here's the sheen of the 80 grit. See, it's got a sheen to it. So this sheen will pick up a bit more of a shine instead of a sheen as we continue. And you'll see how when you progress through the different sanding levels, that it will get shinier and shinier. All right, so let's move up. This is going to be 220. All right, so there you can see what it looks like after the 220. Here's the sand with the original look, and then you can see right there at the joint where it turns a bit shinier. It's looking pretty good. As you progress through the smaller or the finer grains, it actually, you don't have to sand it near as much. You just have to make sure that you're getting rid of the grooves from the previous one. But what it will do is it'll load up the sandpaper a bit more, so you'll go through more of it. So anyway, moving on to the 320. All right, so there you have it at 320. It's actually looking very nice. This would actually pass as a finish called brushed aluminum. But we're going to continue with this. We're going to move on further with this. We're going to get into the higher digits and get this down. Now, as you progress, you'll see the shine, it reflects a lot more, but you'll also notice that you're taking less material off. The 320, which is what we just finished, I would say is the last opportunity for you to clean up any divots or pits or any real obvious imperfections, because from here the sandpaper just doesn't have enough grit to reduce those any further. So from here on it's polishing. We're no longer sanding, and we'll get into the higher grits. All right, let's move down to the 800. All right, so there's 800. Pretty shiny, huh? Moving along. 1 to 1,000. All right, there you have it, 1,000. It's looking pretty shiny. Let's get to the 2000. That'll be the last one before we get to the buffing. All right, well, there you go. There's the 2000. That is almost glassy, almost. And once we get the buffer on there, you'll see it really pop. But that's the majority of the work right there. The heavy work was with the 80, and that got it all nice and smooth. And then after that, we just kind of worked on getting all the grooves out. There's some blemishes here and there, but that makes it unique. All right, let's get the buffing compound out and polish this thing up. All right, so there you go. There is the finished product. We'll get this cleaned up and pull the tape off. That is as good as chrome in my book. That is shiny, like glass. All right, so there you go. That's the finished product. Looks really nice and shiny. This is a refurbished alternator for a 1979 Super Beetle. If you bought a brand new one that was chrome, you probably spent close to $200 for it, and this was all of $60. So you can still get what you want out of it, and just put a little bit more labor into it, and you can have a really nice looking alternator. Just a quick summary. We went over how to service some of the items that are in your alternator. The voltage regulator, both of the bearings, They can all be replaced. And then we went through how to polish it up to make it look sweet. So there we go. My next video will be installing this back into the Volkswagen. So if you haven't already done so, please subscribe so you can see the next step in the installation.